Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Centre for Ecology and Evolution Darwin's Birthday Debate. So a number of you, I'm sure, have been to these before, but for those of you who haven't attended one of our events, this is an annual event. This is the 30th year, 31st year, but maybe the 30th actual. Okay, either the 30th or 31st. 30th of these events we've run, normally at the Natural History Museum. And as most of you probably appreciated, timed to coincide with Darwin's birthday. So actually this year, we've managed to time it perfectly to coincide with Darwin's birthday, which is, of course, the 12th of February. Anyone know the year? Yeah, very good. 1809. So happy birthday, Darwin. And the topic, well, we'll come to the topic, but the topic is a sort of perspective on Darwin's work, but also taking into account kind of modern, present-day, state-of-the-art research. We are delighted to be able to welcome three excellent speakers today, and I will introduce them when we come to them. And they're going to talk to you about their research and experiences with fieldwork and sharing benefits in more equitable ways, sometimes different, more equitable ways. So it will be an interesting discussion, I think, to follow. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to introduce their work. We won't take any questions after those presentations. And after each of the three speakers are presented, we'll then have a panel discussion debate. So the speakers will be up here. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So please do think about questions you'd like to ask our three excellent speakers. We anticipate wrapping up by about 5:45. Then there will be a drinks reception just outside in the foyer. So please do stick around for that if you can. So just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. First of all, I want to apologize for the temperature. I'm so sorry, it's very hot. I wish we could do something about that. Apparently we can't. So please try to stay hydrated and awake throughout if you can. And remember, there will be the reception at the end to revive you. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if you do hear one, please can you exit through the nearest fire escape, which is the set of stairs just to the right as you come out of this door at the front of the lecture theatre. The nearest toilets, the nearest functional toilets are probably the public toilets, which you can get to by going out through the main entrance, which most of you came in through, and then down to the right, down the stairs to the right, and then you'll find the public toilets. After the debate and the reception, the museum will be closed to the public. So again, please do at that time exit through the staircase just here next to the entrance to the lecture theatre. Don't go out through the main public entrance to the museum. I think that's all I need to say at this moment in time. So I'm now going to invite up John and Ida, or John or Ida, or both of them, who is going to say a few words about the Centre for Ecology and Evolution.
Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for coming. So I don't want to speak for very long, but we wanted to welcome you from the London Centre of Ecology and Evolution that, as you know, organizes this event together with a number of other events over the years that we'll talk about. This is really our major one, and it's a fantastic one. I hope that you all enjoy it. But if you like these types of events and you like meeting other people who are interested in ecology and evolution in London and outside, please sign up to our web list, and we'll have some QR codes coming up. And then you will receive very few emails from us, but very informative about all the events that we have.
I think you're automatically part of the mailing list. If you attend any one event, you automatically become a member of CEE. So I think that's how it works. So you automatically get on the mailing list and we send everything to you anyway. But it is a centre that's been established for 30 years, and we'll speak to one of the inaugural founders. We're here from Sandy presently, but it was created as a way for people who work in London to come together and form a network of people who are interested in ecology and evolution, to meet the collaborators who you may well go on to collaborate with for the next 30 years. With that in mind, because of the sponsors that we've most generously been able to get now for CEE, mainly the Genetics Society and the Royal Society, we're actually now able to invite people, both people from abroad to come and speak with us, but also attendees to come from outside London, as well as attendees to come and join us for dinner afterwards with the speakers, if they wish. So there's funds available to apply for to encourage people to come and see what our community of researchers is like in London and how great it is to be part of our community. So be aware that those opportunities are available.
Will be for next year, probably. So.
Oh, for next year, for sure. Yeah. So we've got to thank the Genetic Society and the Royal Society for their generous sponsorship, as well as all of the institutions involved in CEU, all contribute in one way or another. This event in particular is sponsored by the Natural History Museum, and thanks very much to Natural History Museum, particularly Abraham, for organising this so fantastically. Also, UCL makes a big contribution to this event in particular in terms of supporting our dinner afterwards with the speakers, which is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about the next ones.
Oh yeah, so the next events to watch out for. Briefly, we have the Spring Symposium. Oh yeah, we've got. Oh, it's actually Darwin's birthday. As you know, Darwin's birthday. So it's the first time it's happened for 30 years. Everything's 30 years. So upcoming events, we have the Spring Symposium in April, which we think will be at UCL. Well, it will be at UCL. What's unique about the Spring Symposium is it's created by you guys. So you get to submit your ideas for what would make a great one-day symposium or an afternoon symposium. And CE collectively, an institution that hosts the Spring Symposium, will support you in organising that event. And that's a really good thing to do as a way of bringing together people that you think are working on an area of science that you think is really important. And the autumn event, the next event after that is the Family Day, which is at Kew this year, which is a great way for you to bring your family along and talk about ecology and evolution with lots of interesting people at Kew. Other years it's at ZSL. And then there's the Autumn Symposium in October, which is basically an unthemed symposium where everyone gets to come and you can talk about people from each institution and talking about the research that they do. So there's 4 events to be on every year and everyone is welcome to all of those. We're particularly looking for people who are early career researchers, postdocs and PhD students to join the CE committee. This is apparently called a QR code. You can take a photo of it and access the website directly. Also, if you have ideas for Spring Symposium, please do use this QR code to submit an idea. And you may well get to host your own themed event at UCL in spring.
We'll support it and provide some sponsorship for it, but we hope that members will come with their ideas and organize it.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. That's everything from us.
Yeah, I think so.
So thanks
so much. Thank you, Emran.
Yeah, yes, thanks. So just before we get started with the debate, we've got a couple of people who are going to tell us a little bit about their perspectives on this topic, which I'm sure many of us are very interested in. So first of all, I wanted to invite up Rafael, who was one of the proposers of the topic, to say a few words about the importance of this area.
Thanks, Imran. Yeah, it's really exciting. The topic this year is about access and benefit sharing framework and all the myriad of ways in which we can approach it, which we think makes for a very interesting, intriguing, and timely discussion. So it's really easy to tie it with Charles Darwin. We immediately had questions in our mind like, oh, if Darwin did work nowadays, how would he deal with all the access and benefit sharing paperwork? And on the flip side, like, oh, could he even come up with the theory of evolution with all the restrictions we have for our research? We quite quickly and immediately realized that while it would be interesting to put Darwin behind the steering stick of helicopter science, the committee agreed that it will be much more interesting to actually take a forward-looking approach. And while I'm pretty sure we will all agree, or most of us, that in the spirit of it, the access and benefit sharing framework is needed, its implementation is way more controversial. So does it really champion local researchers, or does it merely inhibit global research? And on the flip side, like, do we actually support local communities enough, and do we give them voice in deciding what this access and benefit sharing should look like? So all these really exciting ideas and questions will be something we have in mind during this debate, and I really hope you will join the discussion and enjoy the talk of our brilliant lineup of speakers.
I'd now like to invite Sandy Knapp up, one of the founders of the Centre for Ecology and Evolution, to give her perspectives on this topic, if she wouldn't mind.
Well, that was fun. So now I have to think about what I think about this topic, which is I never have trouble thinking about what I think. What I wanted to say is, and John kind of mentioned this, is the CEE started as a reason to have parties. And, you know, and if you think about why we do, and by the way, I'm Sandy Knapp, and I'm the interim director of research here at the Natural History Museum. So welcome to the museum. And I want to thank Imran for organizing everything, because I used to do this, and it's not as easy as it might look. The museum is a very special place. So Darwin's birthday party is 30 years as a CEE event, is 30 years old today, which means, you know, this is the apex of our existence, and it's all downhill from here. So it's up to you guys to make it not all downhill from here. And I was really excited when Imran and we got together over a coffee and talked about the ethics of field work and the science of tomorrow as a potential topic, because this is something that's really, really important for us who work in today's world, because the world has for a long time been very asymmetrical, with all the power and the money in some places, and all of the diversity and the evolutionary excitement in other places. And it's really important for us to kind of keep in mind that we need to think about evening this out and working as a global community, because unless we work as a global community, the global North and the global South, we're never going to be able to answer any of those questions that we really need the answers to. And sometimes in privileged institutions like UCL or Kew or the Natural History Museum, we often think, well, this is restricting on what it is we want to do. But actually, it's not a restriction, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn about different worldviews, different ways of looking at how we do our science. And if we think of it, the access and benefit sharing, as Rafael said, the implementation is controversial, but actually if we look at it rather than as a challenge and an obstacle, but as an opportunity to do things differently, I think we'll go a long way. And I'm super excited to hear the three speakers for today show us how we can do that in all kinds of interesting ways as we head on our downhill slope towards middle age. Thank you.
So I'm just going to start now by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Hernán Burbano, who is a professor of ancient genomics and evolution at UCL. Hernán studied veterinary medicine and biology at the National University of Columbia and carried out a PhD on the ancient genomics of humans and archaic hominins at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. He then worked at the Max Planck Institute for Biology in Tübingen before moving to UCL in 2019. He was promoted to full professor there in 2024. Hernán's research is highly diverse, and I'm sure we'll hear about some of that today. He's looked at the genomics of modern, historical, and ancient samples spanning across humans, plants, and pathogens. The title of Hernán's talk, as you can see here, is There and Back Again, Fieldwork, Data, and Benefit Sharing Across Centuries. So I'd now like to welcome Hernán to present his talk.
So let me get set up. All right, so thank you very much. So it's a real pleasure to be here in front of you. It's almost like full house, which is like really motivating. And today, what I'm going to do, as was already suggested by the people that introduced the debate today, is to talk about fieldwork, data and benefit sharing across centuries. And my idea is to touch on some of the topics that were already suggested by the organizers of the debate, but I want to highlight some points that I think would be interesting to be debated afterwards, not only by the panelists, but also by the audience. So it's not the three of us talking about something, but we want your engagement. I decided to title the talk There and Back Again. But I think that before we go there, we need to start here. And here, as we have heard, we are on Darwin's birthday, so that's the occasion that brings us here together. And I think there is without a doubt that sample collection and field work was fundamental for Darwin and contribute significantly to the development of evolutionary theory. And when we think about Darwin, we think immediately about the voyage of the Beagle. And that was this now legendary trip that took him all around the world. And even though there is this plain and boring map there, I would like to invite you to close your eyes for a second and imagine landing for the first time, coming from England in the 19th century and landing of any of those places. Don't be shy, close your eyes for a second. I'll do it too. You know, you might be thinking about, Cape Town or the Galapagos or Cape Verde. This is a really fascinating place that surprised him tremendously and inspired him to develop his theory. And when we think about Darwin traveling around the world and describing species, there are like some iconic species that come to our mind. For example, Darwin finches, showing this magnificent variety of big morphologies. But today, and showing my own biases, I'm not going to talk about Darwin finches, but I'm going to talk about plants. And then I would like to jump from Darwin finches to Darwin's herbarium. So Darwin collected a lot of plants during his trip with the Beagle. And so this is about 3,000 plants. And those were arranged on about 900 herbarium sheets by John Stephen Henslow, who was Darwin's botany professor and also who arranged it that Darwin would take the trip originally and go on the Beagle. So those specimens are now curated at Cambridge University Herbarium, these beautiful tomato specimens that is depicted there. And I see Sandy is smiling. All right. This is fundamental, so we're going to look at plants. But I would like to give you a concrete example. Instead of imagine all these places that I mentioned, I would like you to focus on the Chiloé Island. And I should have put an accent here. So the Chiloé Island is here in Chile. Here we have a zoom of the island. And Darwin landed there during the trip, and he was there actually 2 times. And to imagine what the island looked like at the time, so there is this this painting by Conrad Martens that was done after an originally drawing that was done in 1834. And imagine, this is 1834, and they landed there, and this is how Chiloé Island looked like. It looks fine to me. It seems that it was not so fine for Darwin when he was there. I want to now give you 2 of his impressions about the island when he was there. I'm going to read them, and I don't have a British Victorian accent. I should have a poem to help me, but I'm going to read it anyway. So Darwin's remarks on Chiloé Islands. So first he said, in winter, the climate is detestable, and in summer, it is only a little bit better. I should think there are few parts of the world within the temperate regions where so much rain falls. The winds are very boisterous and the sky almost always clouded. To have a week of fine weather is something wonderful. Does this description remind you of another island? Okay. The second remark that I took from Darwin about Chiloé is the following. He said, pigs and potatoes are as plentiful as in Ireland. With the exception of this weighty advantage, Chiloé, from its climate, is a miserable hole. So I don't want you to judge Darwin opinions, and I would like to confess that sometimes I don't feel very positive about living here. But what I want to focus your attention is on potatoes. So he said there that there's plentiful of potatoes there, and I want to move to this concrete example of potatoes. So there you see potatoes, and they look a little bit different than the ones that you are used to buy in the supermarket. And this is the magnificent diversity of potatoes that is present in South America, all sorts of shapes, and you can imagine all sorts of flavors too. And potatoes are very popular nowadays in European cuisine, different type of cuisines, and we all have eaten potatoes. But if we think, let's see the following map that I took for this feed that is called Terrible Maps, but I think it's really good. And this is the distribution of potatoes and tomatoes in Europe, and the edition is 1491. And it has to show you that, you know, even though there are so many elements that we have in our cuisines that we take as granted, you know, they arrive from different parts of the world as a result of trade and exchange at this time, exploration of new worlds that were not known to Europeans. So when I showed that map to a Danish colleague, and then he discovered that potatoes come from South America, he told me, oh, no, I cannot believe that. I thought they were Danish. He was a computer scientist. So. All right, potatoes. I would like to discuss, here is the part of the talk when I'm going to talk about my research a little bit and a little bit of plant biology. And what I want to walk you through is how potatoes fine-tune the time of tuberization. And what is tuberization? So tuberization is when they form the tubers, what is what we eat. So potatoes were domesticated in South America. And what happened there is that those native potatoes there only set tubers under short day conditions, but they cannot do that under long day conditions. What does it mean for a day to be long and short? So this is the typical day length in the Andes. And then you see here that there is not a lot of variance. You know, you have the 12-hour periods, and then this is what is a short day. Now I imagine that people, Europeans got there and brought the potatoes to Europe. Then you are going to have post 1492, and then you're going to have the problem that when the days are getting short, so winter is also coming, like the so-called Game of Thrones problem. Winter is coming, then potatoes would not have like a lot of time to set tubers, and then they cannot survive. So one important point to make here is that potatoes were also moved in prehistorical times to southern Chile. And there are some varieties that are happily setting tubers under long day conditions, even though you would have, in terms of day length, like the specular image of the northern temperate zone. So this is very intriguing. Fortunately, we know a lot about how this process is regulated, thanks to our colleagues studying this molecular process. And there is this gene that is a transcription factor that is called CDF1, which is a master regulator of the process. So the genetic architecture is very simple. There is allelic variation in this particular gene. And then if you have this variant, which is 1.1, that I'm going to represent by this gray square, the potato is not going to, the plant is not going to be able to set tubers under long day conditions. So everything that I show is on a long day condition. However, there is allelic variation, and there are other variants here represented by 3 different colors that would permit that the potato set tubers under long day conditions. So when people discover that and do the experiments, you can see here 2 potato plants. This is a wild type under long day conditions with the gray variant. You cannot see tubers here. But if you have the wild type and overexpress the purple variant in the same plant, you have here that is setting potatoes, so setting the tubers. So that's wonderful. It's a very single genetic architecture. So some time ago, back in, I don't know, 2017, we decided to study and follow this process through time. And what we did is that we went back to the museums and also collect contemporary samples and try to follow this process when potatoes were moved from the Americas to Europe and see what happened. And today I'm only going to present you what happened with this particular gene, CDF1. So this is a map of Europe, and now every single square is representing a sample. And in every part of Europe, you have here samples organized in time. As you can see, we have samples that are very old and some that are more recent. So the oldest ones, of course, from herbarium specimens. And what you can see from this picture is that if you start to look at the oldest samples, they have the great variant. So that is the variant that would not set tubers under long days. And when you start to move through time, and especially if you look at the 19th century, you start to have these colorful variants that are going to allow potato tuberization. Here you have the inset, if you forget. Okay, that the question that we ask at the time is, where are these variants coming from? So obviously the place to look was, is this diversity segregating in South America? So the answer is, when we look, if you call it like a northern South America, we find only the gray variant. So the diversity was not segregating there. But you might wonder, was this diversity segregated in Chile? And that would make sense to look like, because we're talking about the temperate zone too. And here is when I'm going to circle back to Chiloé, potatoes, and Darwin, because then we look at historical samples, included this beautiful potato sample that was collected by Darwin in 1834, landed in 2017 or 18 in the skillful hands of Rafael Gutaker. He sequenced part of the genome, and we figured out that these native potatoes from Chiloé have also the gray variants, which was wonderful because it means they are happily setting tubers there, and they probably are adapted in a different way. And we thought that it's likely that these colorful variants appear in Europe de novo. So these are recent emergence of these variants that confer potatoes the possibility to set tubers under long day conditions. So my intention of showing this little bit of the research that we have done in my lab is to show that this perspective and integration between historical collection and contemporary variation is a very nice approach to understand these processes that happen. In this case, if we use herbarium specimens in the recent past, in the last couple of centuries, and address biological problems in plant biology. So now what I want to do in the next part of the talk is reflect, using partially this research, on the challenges that we have doing field work across centuries. And I'll start from the past, and we're going to talk about the 19th century. And I'm going to assume some of you think, what was doing field work in the 19th century when people went to places like Chiloé? So first, there were like colonial endeavors. There were like big European powers that would go there and explore. I think their intention was similar to us, in terms of they want to classify, they want to describe and collect this diversity to start to understand what is going on there. When we think about local communities, so there was a limited scientific involvement and a limited recognition of the work there. Notice that I said not a limited labor, because some of these efforts were also held by native communities and informed by the communities that were there, but there was a little recognition. Does that pay off? Is there any benefits for these trips that were done in this particular way, in this particular historical context? I would say that the answer is yes. If we think about the publication of Darwin book and the development of evolutionary theory, and if those trips contribute to this development, I think we are all sitting here benefiting from them. Something that I want to remark, thinking about the potato case that I presented, is that this also showed that unanticipated uses of natural history collections, right? When Darwin and others, before and after him, collected those samples, they could have not envisioned that we can nowadays sequence the genomes from this type of samples. And these pictures are for a recent review that we wrote together with Rafael too, where we show that by looking directly and sequencing herbarium specimens, this is a metagenomic project where we can sequence the plants and the associated microbiome. And moreover, there are other approaches that could use these specimens to characterize other types of compounds or molecules. Let's think about RNAs or proteins or isotopes, etc. So those were uses that collectors were not thinking, and probably there are other uses that we are not thinking still. So what are the challenges that we have when we work with these natural history collections? You say these NHC natural history collections. So first is that these techniques are fancy and we can learn a lot, but of course we need to do destructive sampling. And therefore there should be like a balance between curation and this destructive sampling and a careful use of sometimes the overused precautionary principle that said, let's don't do anything now because techniques are going to be much better in the future, which I think is always true, but we need to find a balance between scientific progress and curation and conservation. That might be a point to discuss later. The second point that is important is about the custodianship of the samples. Where are the samples located for these trips and for those collections? So this is an example local only of the distribution of herbaria. So specific museums that store pressed and desiccated plant samples. And as you can see, and as John already suggested, even though diversity start to increase from the poles when you start to go downwards to the tropics, the distribution of herbaria goes the other way around. So the red points is showing you the largest herbaria, including, for example, Kew Gardens and other herbarias in Europe. And you see that the size of the points and the amount of red points in the northern hemisphere is much bigger. So there is this asymmetry that was already pointed out by John when he introduced the symposium. So where should samples be custodied? Should these samples be custodied on the places where they were collected or in the places where they are there? I think the answer is not easy, and there is a lot of nuances there. So I decided to bring this example. This is from a Colombian newspaper, and this is the Natural Sciences Museum of my alma mater in Colombia. And what it's saying here in Spanish is that, the las fracturas, like the fracture, that means like a temporal, like structural damage on the structure, is a problem with the museum, so it's threatening the collection and it's threatening the researchers there. So not all museums are in a great shape. But then we would say, is the situation much better up in the north? I would say sometimes yes, sometimes not. And then look this example. So these make a lot of noise in the news too, and that was about Duke University closing down the herbarium there. That was described as a tragic mistake. And then the New York Times said that it's causing scientific uproar. And so those decisions have been taken unilaterally by the administrators in the university, and it has as bad consequences as the building that is falling apart in Bogota at that moment. So the Duke University example is also is a good case to show the asymmetry. So the collections there are a lot of collections from Mexico, Central America, and the West Indies. And you might wonder what happened in other places or how long has that been going on. And I took that from this review by Chuck Davis. It was an editorial actually in Science, where he described that Princeton and Stanford University ceased all operation of their natural history collections at the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s. So, and also, I don't want to talk about present day politics, but funding is volatile and decisions come fast. So this is a complicated question. All right. If we're talking about custodianship, I want to mention about sovereignty of ownership. Who has sovereignty over biological resources? And I think this is the only slide that has a lot of text. And it has a lot of text because it's about the regulatory framework, and I'm not a legal scholar. So the first thing that I'm going to say is that before 1992, biological or genetic resources were the common heritage of humankind and were freely available for use without restriction. Does that mean that all humans hold hands and sing Imagine around like a bonfire and share the resources? Of course not. So what it meant is that there was an unequal sharing of biological resources. And that was also asymmetric in a way that more biodiversity poor countries that tend to be in the north were benefiting more from the use of biological diversity. What happened afterwards is that we have the Convention of Biological Diversity, and kind of the philosophical change here is the sovereignty of the samples, the states of the countries have the sovereignty of the biological resources. There is some mentions about respect for indigenous local communities, but in reality, if you want to negotiate, you negotiate with a country. And then we have the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. And the intentions, as Rafal pointed out, are to have an equitable sharing of benefits. So you need to have prior informal consents and benefit sharing agreements. I take into account that what is interesting is that people already like envision which type of exploitation those resources can have, because you can talk about biological resources at any research and development about the genetic or the biochemical composition of the diversity, and also including biotechnology applications. So we have a regulatory framework to study or to exploit or use biodiversity, if you like. Are we happy with that? Is that a blessing? Is it a curse? Again, it's like complicated. And I'm going to touch on 3 specific challenges that this regulatory framework creates. So challenge number 1 is that Nagoya Protocol regulate the use of biodiversity across borders because the states are sovereign. So there is no enforcement that is in place within the countries. And that can disfavor local and indigenous communities, because like in theory, they would not have like the right to negotiate Nagoya. But I think that the essence of the protocol, it says, you know, states have ownership of sovereignty over the resources. And I think under the understanding that the states are conserving this biodiversity, so they're the stewards of these resources that they have here, that they have there. But my question is, who are the stewards of biodiversity? So this is also a complex question, because we can take, are the central federal governments? Are the local indigenous communities? Are they both? And then we see cases, is a government that is allowing the legal deforestation of the Amazonas a steward of biodiversity? Is a government that wants to dismantle environmental protection agencies a steward of biodiversity? And then there is a lot of interest there. So this is like complicated and not entirely regulated, and I imagine also difficult to regulate. Challenge 1. The challenge 2, and I think it's appropriate to talk about that because we're in a museum and I've been talking about natural history collections, is that the conception of the protocol was prospective. So it starts to apply after it is signed and people agree, yeah, we are part of the protocol. But should be applied retrospectively when working with natural history collections. So in reality, what the protocol, what happens is that this is the prerogative of the institution that is curating the resources. So they can do it or not. So this is an example, and this is an example that I think is very nice. And this is for the Fungario sequencing project that is coordinated at Kew Gardens by Esther Gaia, and that I am part of, where officers implement and recognize access and benefit sharing agreements with many of the countries of origin, some of which apply retrospectively and include indigenous regulations. So that's great. So there is this traffic light system where you have different codes: red, don't sample, don't do anything; lime, go ahead. And this is the map of the countries. But this is not static. Countries classifications keep evolving. Why? Because they have a wonderful policy team and they go and chat with the regulatory authorities. Recently, Peru and Brazil, that are rather complicated countries to deal with in terms of diversity, agree to be moved from red to green. And to finish with the third challenge is, what is Nagoya telling us in terms of genomics and open science? And this is like my area of research. So when we do genomics with publicly funded, let's say like UKRI, what we're obliged is to put the data up. So you put the data in repositories that the European Nucleotide Archive, and anybody can go and download the data and use it as they see fit. Now the problem is like, who regulates the for-profit mining of this genomic data? You can imagine a lot of secondary metabolites in plant and fungi, for example. And I think that this can be concerning, because if I'm showing you this sequence from a protein, download from a genome, translated, and I tell you somebody's going to profit from that, you say, Hernán, maybe you are crazy. But if I tell you this is the sequence of the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, I'm not that crazy, because because, in order to produce this vaccine, the only transaction that happened, and this is biological diversity too, was digital. You don't need an specimen there because you have gene synthesis. So the last question that I would like to open is, should patent offices at the end trace the origin of the genomic data? Should they also uphold benefits sharing agreements that were previously done? But that's open for discussion too. There I'm back again. So I think we have moved like a long way from the 19th century to the 20th century. I think the situation is better. It's not perfect. We have a regulatory framework, but now in times where short-term pragmatism takes precedence over like long-term sustainability, and in times where private corporations have more power than some states in terms of the amount of political and economical capital that they have, it is us, we need to think about that and help to implement that in the best possible ways. Thank you. And these lovely people talk with me and help me to prepare the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hernán. We'll have, as a reminder, we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end of our talks. So, to introduce our second speaker now. So our second speaker is Dr. Nataly Allasi Canales, who is a Willem International postdoc at the University of Copenhagen and the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. Nataly studied genetics and biotechnology at the National Major University of San Marcos in Peru, followed by a master's in bioinformatics at Fujian Agriculture and Forestry University in China, and a PhD in evolutionary genomics at Copenhagen. Nataly's research is focused on the genetic origin, biochemical diversity, and ecological modelling of bitter potatoes. She's also a strong advocate for indigenous people's rights. As you can see here, the titles of Nataly's talk today is Rooted in Resistance, Agrobiodiversity of Bitter Potatoes. And I'd like to welcome Nataly to give us her talk now.
The laser won't work because I'm very video. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ron, for the introduction and to the organizers. As a researcher, I've always wondered what... Hello? Oh, yeah, yes. Much better. Yes, okay. So as researcher, I've always wondered what shapes our hypotheses. So from my point of view, our hypotheses are shaped by our context, the way we see the world, what phenomena fascinates us, what has been found about it, and how we think about this. And as a Quechua researcher born in the Amazon, this context to me translates to the Amazon and the Andes. Both places are very close, like their nature, cultures, and cosmovisions are very close to me. However, both places have been exploited for the last hundreds of years, making their ecosystems, affecting their ecosystems and the people that depend on them. And as we see problems, also people have envisioned solutions, how to tackle this. And not always thought of by researchers, but also from the community's initiative with a multidimensional focus. Whereas, for example, researchers under Western science epistemologies focus on few, if not just one perspective. And so if we are so lucky that the solutions that we propose can take us to the field, we must consider our morals, ethics, and also the legislation of the field, in the fieldwork. So in the Andes, there is a very important principle for Andean people called Ayin Causai, which translates to buen vivir or to live well. And from the agroecological and food sovereignty perspective, it has two main layers. The first one is the adequacy of cultural skills and resources and technologies that allow food supply and consumption. And then the second layer, which is more cultural, related to the human interactions among and within families and communities, which builds learning, knowledges, community work, and the enjoyment of a healthy life to live well. And also during my fieldwork, I had the great chance to interview people. And I did so, I introduced myself, my motivations and the project in Spanish and in Quechua, and I also had help to do it in Aymara. And people were very enthusiastic to know about this. They were very curious to know the outputs. So by doing that, I realized that this not only creates accountability from my part to show them the results, to go back to them, to WhatsApp them again with the outputs, but also to make my research more relevant for the community. And as for the legislation, it will vary from country to country and what organisms we are focusing on and what approaches, being genomics on wild organisms, the most sensitive issues. And so also while doing research and also by being in the field, I realized how important it was to know about the people's cosmovision. And what is cosmovision? It is the way we see the spiritual and the physical world, collectively or individually. So we all can have our own cosmovision. And so in the Andes, for example, there is no such a thing as a wild species or wild individuals. Everyone is taken care of by other beings. So for example, a vicuña is taken care of by the mountain and the wind and the sun. And also, for example, crops, which are what we would think of as domesticated species, there is a clear symbiotic relationship in Andean cosmovision because we say that we tend potatoes the same way that potatoes tend to us. And in my experience, when I was in Bolivia, I met Doña Vitalia with her daughter. And not only she allowed us to interview her, but also to sample from her plot. And even she invited us her bitter potato-based snack, which you can see there. Which we had to eat on the spot because she didn't want to see it spoiled on the road. And after a long day of fieldwork, we gladly did so. While in Peru, in the Potato Museum, in Potato Park, Don Mariano showed me a puma paw-shaped potato, which is worshipped in households, and which until then I only had known about this potato through books or articles. So even though it was the Andean cosmovision is intuitive and natural to me, I realized I still had more to learn in the fieldwork. So how do I place myself as a researcher, and what do I think one of the big problems to tackle is that the food systems and crop diversity are high risk due to planetary dysregulation, which one of the effects is climate change. And not only that, but additionally, native farmers, especially Andean peoples living in the highlands, who completely almost depend on the kinship they have with crops that only happen there, and other beings. And so my motivation as a researcher is, I found that the kinship between people, the nature and cosmos, which translates into like big diversity of languages, knowledge, and land practices, very inspiring as they still thrive even though in moments of crisis, genocide, colonization. And so this inspires me to help empowering smallholder families or communities in low-income regions to achieve food security, sovereignty. But in order to do that, so I focus on especially local crops. And in this piece, we highlight that there is a disparity of research focus on global crops such as maize, wheat, and rice, as compared to local crops in each place. So we recommend that by integrating another layer of traditional ecological knowledge to the classic humanities and natural science layers, we can better understand complex evolutionary processes like the crop co-adaptation in polycultures, for example, in milpath, or the non-canonical domestication processes, and how selection happens under cultural preferences. And why this is, and since these local crops have the most traditional knowledge linked to them, the research on them could benefit directly to the crop custodians. And so I'm from Peru. I'm obsessed about potatoes. That is the truth. And to choose the local potato crop, I chose bitter potatoes because they show resilience and they have higher glycoalkaloid content, which makes them bitter, toxic, or medicinal, depending on the dosage that people use it. But through traditional knowledge, people have come with a way to freeze dry them at very high altitudes, at low temperature, and by threading on them, they make these freeze-dried products called chuño, tunta, or moraya. Their names in Quechua and Aymara. And these products can be up to 70% of the calorie intake of the people in the Altiplano, in the Andean Altiplano, which means people living from 3,500 to 4,500 meters above sea level. And once these potatoes are freeze-dried, they are called like insurance crop because they can be stored for many years and consumed when other crops fail. And so for my project, I focus on two sets of potato specimens. So the first one is the historical one that it's from the British Empire potato collecting expedition that started in 1939. And we use these samples because it gives us access to a reliable snapshots of past ecologies and biodiversity, but also because we have the tools to understand historical biomolecules like DNA and alkaloids, and that can inform how these bitter potatoes are changing through time. With the second, by comparing it with the second set of samples, which is the contemporary samples that we're using in this project, where we revisited places that we saw in the herbarium sheets, but also we went to places that were predicted to be the most extreme climate. And so here are more or less the specimens that I used from the Kew herbarium material and also the archives from that historical expedition. And this is from the expedition that I had last year. And I want to show you that in the, can I do with this? Yeah, yes. Here, for example, these are rows of common potato, and these are bitter potatoes. So we see that bitter potatoes grow in a more rosette-like. They are shorter, and also the tubers are smaller, and they can withstand frost and drought, as we see here, a wild species. And also, yeah, had a great time to share knowledge with some of the people there. And so when I was looking at these herbarium collections at Kew with my colleague Helen Curry, we realized, why don't we compare what are the rationale behind these projects, right? Because we did realize that there were different contexts making us having different hypotheses for them. So for the historical, we call it EPC, Empire Potato Collecting Potato Collection. It followed a clear extractivist agenda, which main aim was to improve the potato varieties in England from the native potatoes in the Americas. And there was also, although a first collection of local knowledge from South American and indigenous peoples. Later on in the living collections and the breeding experiments, this was they were deleted. And also mainly only scholars are recognized as custodians of knowledge for their contribution. Whereas lately in this project, in the bitter potato projects, it's a more inspired into the community, from the community's concerns, and we try to give new uses, like repurpose the Empire Potato Collection for reimagining indigenous futures while respecting and learning from indigenous farmers, their cosmovision, their ecological knowledges, and cultural practices. And also, indigenous farmers in this project, they have names. And so as I was going to the field, I realized that I had to take full advantage of it. So we did a little survey, ethnobotanical survey, where we learned about the agricultural practices, so the local names of the bitter potatoes that each farmer was keeping, and also that most of them would use guano or alpaca or sheep dung as fertilizer, and they're very proud about it too. And from the biocultural aspect, they mentioned that bitter potatoes are important for them, to them, because they are sustenance, but also healthy food produce for them. And also it gave them cultural identity and pride to still grow them. And I also asked about what are your concerns about the changes, like the soil and pathogens. Well, at that altitude, few pathogens really thrive, but the main concern was extended frost and drought periods. So in other words, climate change that was happening more and more often is happening. And so for these, we used ecological niche modeling approaches, where we see, for example, we identify areas where the habitat suitability for one of the bitter potatoes, Solanum mahanguiri, the cultivated bitter potato, Solanum mahanguiri, would be affected. So the green area is where it will stay unaffected, the red where it will be at risk, and the yellow, the potential expansion if people grow them. So in short, in percentage, the area that is at risk is around 8.8%, which in numbers may not seem much, but I think people here around Oruro in Bolivia would really affect their lifestyle and their diets. And also the altitude will change to be a bit higher. And so, yes, and how do I envision to best tackle access, sharing, and benefits? So I think, I think this is a great framework from Ibarra and colleagues who made a 10-step transdisciplinary research, where they include indigenous peoples and local communities in all steps, including from the conception of the question, the hypothesis, to data collection, data analysis, refinement of techniques, disseminating the results and applying the results in situ. And I think they really nailed that framework. So I want to also leave with I want to end my intervention with a few contemplations about that will kick off later on the debate. So the questions would be, should every organism in every corner of the world be researched? How would that impact the organisms, their habitat, and associated organisms and their capitalism specifically? How would the local society benefit from it? And should all biological data be open and free? And would this arise to biopiracy cases? Finally, I want to thank my people.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And now I will introduce our third and final speaker of the debate. So our final speaker today is Dr. Nussaibah Raja-Schoob, who is a senior data scientist at Nielsen IQ in Nuremberg, Germany. Nussaibah studied geography at King's College London and physical geography at Ankara University in Turkey, and she then undertook a master's and PhD in paleontology at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany. Nussaibah's research has focused on using novel computational approaches to understand the impact of environmental change on reefs, but she's also very interested in the practices behind fieldwork and research in the field of paleontology. The title of Nussaibah's talk today is "The Past is the Key to the Present," and can we all welcome Nussaibah to the stage?
Great, thank you, everyone. Well, I'm not going to continue with the potato theme, so I hope nobody's too disappointed. When I thought about the title, about how would Darwin do field work today? Is this working? Yeah. I thought a bit about like privilege and power when it comes to doing research, and how actually Darwin was in a position of privilege when he was on his voyage, and how even now as a British male researcher, he would still be in a position of privilege when doing research. So it would be the same, but not really. Okay, but first of all, as a modern researcher, everyone needs a Google Scholar page, and even Darwin has one. And I really want to know who set that up, because he has a verified email. But as you can see, he gets cited every year, and every year, you know, the number of citations go up. Very, very prolific researcher. Anyway, but if Darwin were to be a paleontologist, where would he actually be publishing his papers? So what we did actually with Emma Dunn, also at the FAU now, we actually looked at where people actually publish and which journals they go for. So here we're only looking at paleontological journals, and basically a lot of it tends to be in low impact factors is apparently what people like. Impact factor, I think everyone knows what that is, and we all know that, you know, it's all wrong and it doesn't mean anything, but people still look at it when you decide what to where to publish. But the important thing, would Darwin make it in Science or Nature? So that was a really cool project that we did. And what we actually did was compile like all the titles, paleontological titles from Science and Nature, and actually just looked at which words come up more frequently. And if you look at it here, evolution comes in here, origin and species. So yes, he would likely had made it in Science and Nature just based on his title. However, you all know how long a Nature or Science paper is. his 500 pages book, would that have fitted in one science paper or one Nature paper? Probably not. And this is where I'm going with this, is basically it would be a series of papers nowadays. It wouldn't be one book, it would be a series of papers. And he would be working with different people, and he would basically, Darwin would not be Darwin, is where I'm going with this. Darwin would be a series of people collaborating with each other and maybe then coming up with a origin of species. And what we are looking at here is just basically how, like, I just want to focus on the second one where you see, like, if you look at the number of citations here, the number of authors is actually really important. And if we go back to Darwin's Google Scholar page, being one single author and having so many citations is actually not very common. When you collaborate with people and when you actually work with other people, that's when your research actually gets more exposed. And apparently the number of pages is important for whatever reason. But again, this is what I wanted to show, is like, we know now that people don't do science alone. They work with people, and most likely he would be working with people too, but with whom is the question. So when we talk about science and who does science, it's very important to know who actually has the resources to do science. So I learned that a lot through my own research journey or even academic journey, because I studied here in London in a university that had a lot of resources. And then I went to Turkey in Ankara, and that was a governmental university with no funding at all for my department. And then I had to kind of scrape resources using open tools and everything. And this was such a contrast from what I was used to in London. And it took me 3 years to actually get used to this and to understand how people outside of the UK, which then was my only point of reference, did research, and how hard it was actually to do that research, because I was in a country where no one speaks English, like maybe 1%. Even at the university, they had an English requirement for professors and lecturers, but actually it was just a paper that people had, because all the research was actually being done in Turkish. So English was actually not useful, but they still had to publish in English language publications. Why? Because that's the only way that their research would have been exposed. So we actually had to do both Turkish and English. And coincidentally, now I have papers in Turkish, which is getting harder and harder to read as time goes past, because I'm forgetting my Turkish. But this is where I'm going with this, is basically the academic world right now is made for certain people, and a lot of other people have to fit in that box. And science is not a meritocracy. So this is really cool, because I don't know if you've seen this, but it's actually a interactive visualization for this. And it's basically like 95% of the researchers who've won Nobel Prizes are part of the same academic family. And also, when you look at who actually is collaborating with whom, usually it's the same labs collaborating with each other, or it's the same universities collaborating with each other. So there's always this common ground, which a lot of people don't venture out from. So would Darwin have done that? So as I go with my talk, it's just basically like, would he have thought of that? And this is what I want you also to think about. So for example, this is based on just geoscience topics. So this is a study that was done. Okay, this was a study that was done looking at papers in geoscience, and only out of how many is that? 182,000. Only 2,000 had African authors, and this was on African topics. And it is still the case now that when people are doing research on low-income countries or low-income regions, it's still very rare that local authors are being included. And some people might ask, okay, do we really have to include them other than the fact, okay, we have a local author there? And yes, it is, because these people are there. And if you're doing field work, they are the people who are closer to that place, and they are the people who actually know best, probably, about that place. A little personal story from my side. So I'm from Mauritius, and I don't know if you've read Darwin's journals or letters, but by the time he reached Mauritius, he was very seasick and wanted to go home. But it's a very, very, very nice island. And I actually was a biologist working on a conservation project of the pink pigeon, which is an endemic bird in Mauritius. That was already 10 years ago. More than 10 years ago now. And at that time, in Mauritius, conservation was only being done, well, mostly being done by foreigners. So I was actually at that point in my team, the only Mauritian out of, I think we were a team of maybe 10, 15 people on that. It has since changed, and the reason it has actually changed is because of visa restrictions for foreigners to work in Mauritius. That was the only reason, actually, that we, the organization, which is a Mauritian organization, but it collaborates with a British organization, actually. And when I was there, so I worked there for a year, there were a lot of foreign scientists coming to work on the birds as well, like not only the pink pigeon, but also other birds. But a lot of them did not talk to me. I mean, I'm not that special. You don't have to talk to me. But then they only started talking to me when they learned I had studied in London. And, or that I worked at London Zoo, for example, or, you know, like I had these connections. Before that, I was completely invisible. And it was very interesting to be on that side of the world. And that's what I'm saying. It's like I was there doing field work on this specific bird, walking my rounds every day. I knew who was laying eggs, who were not, where were the fights. So I knew the field, but no one would talk to me when they were doing their research, which was quite interesting, because if they had asked me, I don't know, about the birds, I probably would have been the person back then who knew everything about them in that particular location. So this is what I mean by the people who are close, they know best, because they might have insights that you did not think about. Yes, you might have the overall, topic in mind, but there are the little things that can change how you see something. And these little things, they only come from having the local perspective or from seeing something every day. But when we look at like the data structure in general of where biodiversity records are or where the herbarium is, Hernán already showed us the map of the herbarium. I have another one coming up, just so you know. But we see that a lot of it is concentrated in the global north, so in very rich countries. So whether we're talking about birds, for example, or I will show you about paleontological data, a lot of the data structures, the data infrastructure as well. So it could be databases, could be museums as well. We are in the Natural History Museum. You know what's here. But also when you look at like how the naming of species are done, a lot of them are named after Europeans, a lot. And I will also show you something about that in a bit. So what I did, together with a lot of colleagues, we actually looked at one specific database in paleontology. So that's a paleobiology database. And we actually wanted to know whether we can detect this historical and socioeconomic biases in the data sets that we are using every day. And these data sets come from fieldwork done by people. And we just wanted to see what the patterns were. So what we did is we actually went through every single paper that's in this database since the 1990, and then we looked at the affiliation data, and we also looked at where the fossils were collected and who basically did the work, did the research, and we also look at the funding, but then the data was not that great, so we didn't look much of that. And what we saw is that 97% of fossil data is actually collected by researchers based in Northern America and Europe alone. So the 3% is the rest of the world. 97% is actually just from the US, the UK, and mostly Germany and France. And then everything else is, yeah. And the US actually has a lot of fossil collections, but a lot of it is also local. That's why it's like exponentially more usually than the other countries. But yeah, I would recommend you to read this, even if it's my paper, because I think it's a really cool one. Also, this was a side project to my PhD, which is why I'm so proud of it. But also what we looked at is where the people actually went. And this actually showed quite a difference. So if you see here, you see what's highlighted, and it's what we call the global north. And then where they go is the global south, because the rest of the world is now highlighted. And what we did was basically calculate a parachute index. And basically, this looks at like where papers are, where the fossils are, who are writing the papers, but also whether the local researcher were included. And here, I'm just going to briefly mention this because it doesn't go with Darwin, so I didn't want to mention. But you see that there's Myanmar, for example, that's highlighted quite here. You don't see it very well, but that's basically because of commercial fossil dealing that basically had a drain out of the country into China and then was just available on the market to be bought. That's just a side note. We're just going to go back to Darwin. So I also looked at the Cambridge University Herbarium, but all the data is on GBIT. They did a great job with the digitalization of the collections. So what I did is basically looked at everything that, based on the database, was collected by Darwin, and I just looked at which countries the specimens came from. I think we're looking at about 900 plant specimens here. Only one came from the UK. So what we see here is basically Darwin had a lot of, and we know this already, that had a lot of plant specimens from Latin America. And what I wanted to like talking back about like who would have Darwin collaborated with. Hopefully, or most likely, he would have collaborated with researchers from Latin America. And within one science diplomacy framework that we looked at is basically like how people from different countries do science together. We actually surveyed about 100 researchers who had such collaborations already. So European researchers, including the UK, and Latin American, and basically asked them what barriers did you have when you had such collaborations, and what would you have done better and things like that. And a lot of it is basically funding. So sometimes there was limited funding on mostly the Latin American side, but also communication, language barriers. Intercultural communication was very important because when you do research, you tend to think very academically, but the culture is very important. The way, like, even the academic culture changes from countries to countries. Again, when I moved from London to Turkey, I had to learn how the new culture is. And it was very different to how things are done here. And then I moved to Germany, and that was, again, very different. Even language barriers. So we had one person who said that one person did not speak English, but we spoke in French and someone else spoke Portuguese. And then within them, they managed to communicate with each other. So I don't know how they managed to do work, but apparently it worked. I mean, this was also done within the pandemic, so a lot of things were disrupted. But also they did say they had administrative issues and payment delays when it came to bureaucracy as well. So these are basically the four sides of the barriers that we looked at. And what I want to show you is like, collaboration is hard work, and I think all of us know this. It's not enough to just think about, okay, I have to include someone from this country on my paper so that, you know, it looks fine or whatever. It's a long-term thing. And when you think about all of these things that you have to take into account, and I think Hernán already said, like, there is some restrictions sometimes when it comes to collaboration. Like, you do have to plan in advance. It should not be a last minute thing. And what we also have to think about is like, what's our agenda from being in the global north might not be the agenda of the local researchers. So you do have to think about like, okay, I'm interested in this fossil or this plant. Are they also, like, does it make sense for them to work on this? So, but also what they also said was that the government was also a barrier to them for this collaboration, because the government sometimes did not believe that the agenda of the local researchers was actually the agenda of the local researchers, which was very interesting to us because that's something I never thought about. But also they also said, like, these are just quotes from the survey that we did, by the way, that their findings were not well received as well by the European counterparts. But also what they showed is like, and this comes back to the academic family thing, is like they were only able to collaborate because they had worked together before, probably at the same university, and then they moved to another country, and that's what allowed them to collaborate together. So global mobility for researchers, and we all know that again, is very important. So talking about global mobility now, when it comes to plant specimens, and we know where the herbariums are, a lot of them have left the countries to actually go in the big herbarias of the world to be reposited there. So a lot into Europe and a lot into North America again. So we have these same patterns, whether it's fossils or plants. And then if you look at the European herbaria, they tend to have a lot more international collections, and then other countries tend to have more national ones. So it's like, okay, you know, you have like the national ones, but then you have the big ones where it's just more, like if you look at the NHM, for example, you tend to have fossils from different parts of the world. We know why. And it's the same for the herbaria as well. But then this is a problem when we talk about global mobility as well of researchers. It's very easy for someone who's British to go somewhere to do field work, to visit a museum. I can tell you, not being from Britain or Germany, even if I live there, it's very hard to get anywhere if you do not have a British, European, or American passport. And for a researcher who's, for example, in Brazil or Argentina, it's very, very hard to come over here to do research on the specimens that are here. So digitalization is actually like something maybe that's helping, but a lot of collections have not been properly digitalized. So we still there's still this barrier in a way to, we're not even talking about taking them back to the countries, because that's very controversial apparently. But digitalization is a way to kind of like get to the next level of that. So what we did also was looked at the dinosaur holophytes, because that was cool as well, and where they are at the same time. And here, what we have is basically the same patterns, is that everything is always going towards Europe or North America. And then that's the last bit I will talk about. What I also looked at is basically the specimens that were in the GBIF database, and 13 out of these 900 were actually named after Darwin. And what we have to think about, and this is a very small thing, but it has quite some influence, is like even the naming of species has a political factor between after them, because we actually hold power into like how we're calling something. And as I said, 95% of bird species are described are from the global south. And we actually saw the same in dinosaurs, where most dinosaurs are from China, USA, but you also have Mongolia, for example, here. And then most of the publications, so this follows the same pattern again. So the US, China here, because they are really, really big in terms of dinosaur paleontology, but you see that the UK moves up, Germany, Russia, France also in the game here. First authors, very similar. Then when we look at like what dinosaurs on, who people are naming dinosaurs after, it's basically Americans or British people, Canadians. And it's the same thing for like, so here it's mostly like, for example, it could be an American dinosaur as well, like a dinosaur found in America as well. But then you also have like coming from other countries, we have very similar patterns. So because a lot of names, and it's very traditional, that they are based on Latin and Greek, you see that there is a barrier to education and science communication because you're still using this Latin and Greek framework. And in dinosaur names, for example, you see now that there is an increase in non-Latin names, and this has actually made them more popular with the local community. So it's not just about the research in general, it's like how do we actually make it more more appealing as well to not even the local researchers, to the local community. And I think this is something that is not just applicable to dinosaurs, but also to other taxonomy groups as well. But this was just basically kind of like food for thought, showing you different things of what we've done, and maybe have you think about like, would Darwin think about all of this as a modern researcher, or would he not? I'm just gonna leave it here. If you want to know more about the research, we have a website and you can check it out. And yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you so much to all of our speakers. So we now are going to open things up to our audience. So I'd like to start by inviting our three speakers to come back up if they wouldn't mind. We have some nice purple chairs for you. Hopefully this is working. Does this work? So, as I said, we now have some time for questions for the speakers. And actually the speakers did a fantastic job of providing us with some questions to ask them already. So I thought I would just start off by stealing one from Nataly's talk, which I thought would be interesting to get all of your perspectives on, which is basically, should we research all organisms, fossils, plants, animals, or should we not research some of them? So because you're closest to me, not for any particular reason, I'm going to give you the microphone first in case you'd like to comment on that question.
I don't know. I don't see if it is done in the proper way. Why not? I think as scientists, as humans, we're driven by curiosity and we want to understand. So I don't think why something should be left to be investigated, but taking into account collateral damage, right, and doing that properly, I would not see any particular reason to say no.
So from from my point, is it? Yeah. From my point of view, I think maybe for now there are not there is no strong legal framework that allows this yet. But I hope that, and I think it's moving towards it after the last global biodiversity framework since last year from also the COP at Cali. I think things in that way are moving quite positively. But as it is right now, I think that maybe that's, yeah, there is no enough framework that can protect very well certain species and the people that live with them.
Well, I think when we think about research, are we saying that should we write papers about all of this? Probably not. When we talk about research, like from a Western point of view and from an indigenous point of view, you would know it's very different, right? And what we understand by research is basically like, you have a project, you work on it. But I think when we talk about research, it's like lifelong learning. And this is something that we can continue doing within frameworks that are maybe already available. But we don't necessarily have to I think we have to change the ways in which we talk about science and talk about research, and not everything should be, okay, I write a paper about it and then it's over, I move on to the next project and things like that. So I think it's a very vague question in terms of should everything be research? I don't know, for fossils, for example, should we look at all the fossils? Because a lot of people are like, oh, if it goes back, we won't have access to it or something like that. It's like, yeah, but it's been dead for hundreds of years. I think you can wait a little bit. So I think it's more about what does research mean, and how do we disseminate it rather than anything.
Great, thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the audience? We've got a microphone at the back.
There's one here.
Hi there. I just wanted to thank you all for very interesting talks, but I also wanted to flag something that might be of interest to people in the audience here today, that the Biological Journal of the Linnean Society is actually running a special issue for mobilizing natural history collections from the Global South as well. So it might be something that's of interest for people to submit papers to. So I just wanted to raise that. Thanks, everyone.
So just because I think the microphone audio might be a bit on the low side, I think you were mentioning about the Biological Journal of the Linnean Society is running a special issue on mobilising collections, was that right?
Yeah, mobilising collections from the Global South.
From the Global South in particular. So I think that seems like a really interesting read for lots of people.
It's working, no? Yeah, okay. I don't know how to make it louder. Maybe we have to be louder.
I wanted to ask what you thought the role of funders in the Global North is in ensuring that researchers are working with local researchers and local communities, and in making sure that they are engaged, involved and credited in research. Is there anything that funders here can do?
I don't know about British funders, but I know about the European Union, for example, and they already have a framework, and it's basically compiled by, I think, people from the medical field, because that's where a lot of money goes when it comes to funding, and they actually have a very, very short but very good description of what people should do when it comes to funding. And a lot of it is about indigenous and local involvement as well. So I would really recommend to just go for that guideline, because I know the people who wrote it as well, and they did a fantastic job. And if funders from other, this is just the EU, so the German funding agency, for example, does not follow that. But if they would just actually adopt the same policies, it would just make things easier for them as well, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and come up with new policies.
So from funders, I was not aware of that. I should read those guidelines. But while applying for permits, sampling permits in Bolivia, I did. There is the government has a line about it that if we are sampling in Bolivia, we have to include a co-author from any institute, like the herbarium or the university, and yeah, they will be credited as such. So that is the involvement, at least at academic level, of local researchers. Yes, that's my experience so far.
So I think the power is in the funders have a lot of power. You know, they are the ones that are giving the money, and especially if they are like national funders. And just to give an example, not necessarily related to collection, is about like open science. You know, the moment that UKRI said you need to preprint all your research because it goes to a journal, then we need to do it. And this is something that, you know, other funders like Howard Hughes Medical Institute are doing. So I think those mandates, if they come directly to the funders, I think are strong. But I think us as a community also can steer in that particular way. Like sharing thoughts with some of my colleagues, with our editor-in-chiefs of journals, you know, you see that the journal can encourage, and there is an example of molecular ecology where you want to publish a paper there, and then you have data collected somewhere else. You need to have a statement of benefit sharing there, that they're going to see what is your statement, what happened. So there should be like some dialogue between that, but I think funders have a lot of power when they come from the state. So it should be like, if that becomes a state like policy, I think that would be important and would steer that in a good direction.
Since I have the microphone, I wonder to what extent the funders from rich countries should you just directly fund researchers in the countries where those where the science should be done, rather than fund UK researchers to go there and force people to collaborate with them. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
I don't know. I think this is like more complicated question because, you know, it's a question of, I think it's probably possible, but, you know, where taxpayers want the money to go. I don't know exactly what would be the best solution, but I see that's complicated. But you see in the European Union, if you look at certain type of grants, like synergy grants, they say you can include actually a researcher that is not based in Europe. There is like a couple of Europeans working there. So I think there are ways to do that, but I'm not sure.
That. So when we did our survey of like people who collaborated like between Latin America and Europe, what they did mention, and this is part of the science diplomacy framework that I was talking about, there was actually a lot of collaborations in terms of funding as well, where the two governments actually had some funding together, where, you know, like I think it was Brazilian and one European country, no clue which one. But there were a lot of those. And this is something that's very important when we talk about like science, because it is actually being recognized that science is international, even by the funders. And nowadays there are a lot of this sort of funding going on. However, it's not for all of the areas of science. So I know a lot from the medical field that there's a lot of these sort of things happening, but for paleontology, for example, that's probably not going to happen. But a lot of like fields that are considered very important politically as well. So health or even genetics, for example, I think is one where these sort of funding now exist.
Thank you. I was curious. So in the recent years, we have seen that many museum collections have been asked from the Global South, from different institutions, in order to repatriate those collections, especially art collections. Do you know if there is something similar happening with natural collections?
Talk about the paleontological collection. So from Brazil, for example, there was this one dinosaur where there was a lot of uproar about in 2020, because it was discovered that there was the it was illegally collected from Brazil. It made its way to Germany, and then the people wrote about it in the paper. But then all the Brazilians like, no, actually, there's no way they could have gotten this legally. And what happened, and the only reason it has gotten repatriated is because the government figured out that they lied about some paperwork. So not that they actually stole it, but they lied about the paperwork, which made everything, yeah, according to German standards, not right. But what now they have done is repatriated, and what happened is they did a whole inventory of the whole museum, and now a lot more are going back. And with fossil collections, I think there is a lot of from Brazil, for example, there is a lot of local involvement to actually get the fossils back, and they actually have museums. Like they do have museums there to keep all of this. So it's not like, but about other specimens, I don't know about the herbaria specimens.
Well, I know that some curators from like ethnobotanical collections have sent back with, no, actually indigenous leaders from Brazil went to the collections to have like ceremonial handover of like sending back. And so there was a ceremony, and I think as I have talked to people, it could be something that if people like local people are interested, like indigenous people are interested in getting those back, I think the curators may, yeah.
I have nothing to say.
I was just going to make a comment because something that has occurred to me over many, many years of working in the field is that it used to be, it's changing, but it still happens a lot, is people will go in the field, people from the global north will go in the field, they'll spend their 2 or 3 weeks in the field collecting their things. They just put them in a box and say, okay, here, you in this museum, ship these back to me. And they never spend any time in the collection in the country where it is. So I think there should be, I mean, and this is partly because of funders, and you're right, Hernán, funders have a huge amount of power. And if funders were to say, you go do field work, you spend an equal amount of time in the collection or the museum in that country, helping to strengthen their capacity, helping to do that. But that costs money, and people want to maximize things. So I just wanted to know your thoughts about that, about strengthening local institutions through actually working in them and collaborating.
I think that's very important, and I can bring an example that is not necessarily collection, but is collecting fungal pathogen collections in the field, like in Africa. And we have projects that we do that both in Bangladesh and in Zambia. And then the framework of the project needs to be like a multilateral institute, like the CIMIT, which is the center that is breeding maize and wheat. And then through them, we have the collections to the local researchers over there. And this type of frameworks allow this type of collaboration because because of that there is also some level of distrust. And especially when you work with pathogens, because reporting a pathogen is something that is not nice, because that can have some trade barriers. Though we are funded by BBSRC for this project, there is no requirement for the BBSRC. And some of the funds, I have the fortune to work with people that are funded by more richer, like private funders, let's say like Lord Sainsbury and the Sainsbury funding. So we can do that. But I think I have not myself budgeted for that, and I don't know if I budgeted, I'm going to get it. But I think it's very important. I agree.
Also, personally, I would agree. This is a great idea, except that sometimes after the field work, one is destroyed and completely, especially collecting plants. Yes, but it is something that should be implemented and, yeah, budgeted as well. I agree with that.
Yeah, and as you said, the funders have the power, but the researchers are writing the proposal, right? So it's not only the funders who can actually push this. I think if researchers start to actually budget for this and have enough time, because I mean, I talked about like collaboration and everything being a long-term thing, but when you're 2 weeks or 3 weeks somewhere, you don't have time to actually build this connection and collaboration. So funding needs to be more long-term to actually allow for this sort of things to be budgeted as well.
I wanted to make a point about living material collected for conservation purposes, particularly with what you said about the pink pigeon. I'm just thinking, though, a little bit off my own point, that it's a shame we can't have a perfect world where every country has a great institution, storage for specimens. And I'm thinking of what happens when you collect stuff in Ethiopia and it ends up in a shed with a padlock on it at the back of the museum in Addis, you know. So that's an aside for me. But the pink pigeon would probably not exist anymore if somebody from the UK, Gerald Durrell, hadn't gone out and collected them. And he certainly raised the profile in Mauritius. And the whole idea was not to steal those animals, but was to get them breeding, so let them survive as a biological entity, as a living thing, presumably with all the balanced genetics, and then send them back. And there's a lot, there's so many examples I could think of species. I go on for a whole conference, if you like, but I won't. We ought to do one. But there are huge issues there. I wanted to just raise that, really. Your experiences, by the way, I find extremely interesting of what actually happens back in the field.
The pink pigeon is actually a really, really good example. That's true, because so basically when they reintroduced it, there were only, I think, about maybe 50 individuals in the wild, and now there is about 500. So it's only because of the breeding program, actually, that and here we actually see the importance of, for example, zoos and museums as well. Well, not museums, but sanctuaries as well, which was very important. But I think for living specimens, it's a bit different, because it's not like you took something. Well, I mean, you took the birds, but originally there were still birds there. It's not like you took all of them. But I think for fossils, for example, it's very different, where you move something from the ground that's not going to be there anymore, and then you bring it to another country, and then you can't put it back is where I'm going with this. And I think it's very different from living specimens.
But even in the country where the fossil came from, you can't really put it back.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
It's got to be in a museum or a study item or in a school or something. By the way, he didn't take all the pink pigeons, just a few of them. And
no, I know this.
And there'd been a terrific loss of pigeon biodiversity in those Indian Ocean islands for hundreds of years. Well, since the dodo, a lot more species have gone extinct, and there was no local effort to save them or even interest from outside, sadly, until we got to the pink pigeon, which is almost the last one.
Yeah. It is the last one in Mauritius that's left now. Yeah, definitely.
Should we take maybe one or two more questions before our reception? Okay.
Hello, I was wondering, from your observations, what are the main incentives for funders when they fund projects that research, for example, zoology or ecology in the global south? Is it monetary value or potential monetary value? Is it prestige? Is it scientific interest? Is it so conservation? What are the main incentives, and how do you see that shaping the research that's going on in the global south? How does that shape the way that people do research or the objectives of the research? And do you see these funders as usually being ecologically or, I guess, conservationally conscious?
So from my experience with Danish funders and the funding I can apply for, I think they would appreciate and also aligning with my research, like the neo-domestication of like smart crops. I think this is something that is very much trendy, or like I see more people getting such grants. So I would imagine that I would have to write something like this at some point. Yes, and also like very heavily biotechnological kind of like applied plant science. Yeah, that's mainly, and I find it more and more in that way. Maybe I can also say or mention the challenges that I see, and sometimes I get discouraged, like to learn more about these local crops, and I'm afraid that maybe there is yeah, funders maybe won't understand it very well. So I think there has to be like certain way that I would need to frame differently that so that these projects like that could get funding.
You take the last one.
Can you hear? Is it good? So my question was, it was touched upon about the globalization of crops, I think. And obviously, sharing resources can be a good thing from a research standpoint. As you mentioned, the potato, which has now become a staple of European food, so it has many benefits. But the question talks about benefits aside from human benefits. Could globalization and sharing resources also pose a risk to biodiversity? So in a sense, setting aside the benefits, are there also a risk to biodiversity by globalizing and sharing all these resources?
I think yes. I mean, I think you're thinking about like sharing like living collections on or things like that. Is that correct? I mean, I think one of the major like threats that we have with globalization and in ecosystems are like alien and invasive species, right? And then we have like a rise of those species with globalization. Like this is something that I can think from the top of my head that is risky. Just to make a short point about crops, and even though I don't understand the law perfectly, I think there's some exclusion of some of the crops from the Nagoya Protocol that goes through a law that needs to be worked with the World Food Organization, where there is like a more facility to share those kind of resources. And the idea is that because the food security is important, so I think there is some relaxation about sharing with some crops.
Okay, I think in that case we'll wrap it up there. So first of all, I'd like to encourage everyone to give our three speakers a round of applause for their fantastic presentation. Lots of great discussion as well, and hopefully that can continue for those who can stick around for the reception after this. One thing I wanted to mention is we do have some representatives from the Royal Society here. The Royal Society are one of the sponsors of the Centre for Ecology and Evolution. They have a table, so please do go have a chat with them about their work. Was there anything else you wanted to say, John or Ada, before we break up?
I would like to thank the Royal Society, Genetic Society, the Natural History Museum, and UCL for sponsoring us. Imran for organizing everything, basically, and Rafael and Julia have been very involved in the deciding. All of our speakers for coming here and having a very interesting discussion. This is my last event as co-director of CEE, so thanks everybody for your support. And Richard Nichols, who's somewhere.
Richard Nichols is going to try and take over from Ida, but we want to thank Ida very much for the extensive work she's done.